Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Chair. The Fair Work Amendment Respect for Emergency Services Volunteers Bill is dangerous legislation. If you're committed to public safety, as I would hope all senators are, you would vote against this legislation. When you look into it, when you look into the way the minister has handled it, what happened during the election campaign with regard to the submissions and the evidence that was given, you see that this is a major stitch-up. It really continues the ongoing way that this government works to undermine workers' rights, works to undermine how unions operate, and will go to extraordinary lengths. And in this case, we're talking about the undermining of public safety. This bill is political opportunism, and it should have been buried. It should have never come to life. It should now be buried. I say it should never have come to life after the federal election, because it was part of that whole ploy. Sometimes bad tactics have come out in election campaigns, and this was certainly one of them. The government argues that this bill is needed to protect the rights of Country Fire Authority volunteers, but that does not stand up to scrutiny. When you look at what the minister has said, when you look into what's stated about what this bill will do, that certainly isn't the core of this bill. Volunteer firefighters do an incredible job in Victoria and across the country. The enterprise bargaining agreement the Turnbull government is trying to destroy with this bill will not undermine the massive contribution volunteer firefighters make. I was able to sit on this inquiry, hear the evidence, read many of the submissions, and the evidence is overwhelming in that it does not back up what the government asserts. In fact, we heard evidence from volunteer firefighters working at integrated stations where volunteers are working side by side with paid firefighters that do not support the bill, volunteer firefighters that do not support the bill. And some of their evidence. Mr Luke Samoy from Craigleburn told the committee, "On behalf of my brigade, we do not want this bill to go ahead. We want this settled. I would like this settled. The fire season is coming up and we do not need this. This has gone on for too long. The EBA has got nothing to do with volunteers. If anything, it is going to better us and better our skills and better our equipment, because half the equipment that we have got today we would not have if it were not for staff." That is the honest truth. I can stand here and put my hand on my heart and tell you that from a volunteer firefighter. And then from Mr Raj Ver, a volunteer for Hallam, he told the committee, "You probably hear a lot in the media, and the VFBV love to speak about 60,000 volunteers and how they represent the 60,000 volunteers. Well, I am one, and one of many, who stands before you today and tells you that we are not represented by the VFBV. And that's why I do urge senators committed to public safety to ensure that when the next firefighting season hits Victoria, that the uncertainty and the undermining that is at the core of this bill is not allowed to settle into how things will operate in Victoria. So that I believe that there are informative comments that really do deserve our consideration when we're looking at this bill. But back to the issue of public safety, and this is a key matter that Minister Michaela Cash sidesteps when she comes to talk about this issue. What we need to look at is what is happening in Melbourne. Out of Melbourne should receive the same level of protection for firefighting that all people of Melbourne receive. Having sat on the inquiry last week, what became abundantly clear is that we're talking about areas of Melbourne where, that were once country areas but are now part of the outskirts of Melbourne, areas that deserve full fire protection. Clearly Melbourne is a growing city, and on those outskirts it once was farming land. Now, when you visit there, you're often seeing large housing divisions. And these were areas that have been well serviced by the CFA. CFA was able to do a very effective job when there was rural workers and farmers. Farmers were, and these rural workers were the locals who volunteered and did a mighty job as firefighters. But as I've said, these outskirts are changing, so now what we see is so many of those areas, the workforce now is quite different. But first off, I just wanted to quote from a very significant comment from the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission. They said, "We've got a problem here in Victoria with these boundaries. What is called country in some areas is still legitimately country, but in some areas it is now suburban Melbourne. So what are we going to do about it?" A very important question, and a question that this government is refusing to answer, and it could be to the severe detriment of public safety and saving lives. So again, this is a reference to those areas where locals are now more likely to be working not locally but distant in offices and factories. And if you're not working locally, you're not readily available to volunteer. And the people who live in these areas, they pay their rates and taxes like other city residents, and understandably expect and have a right to expect that firefighters who cover the rest of the city will turn up to their part of the city and fight fires. Now, that is what we should be dealing with here. How do we ensure that their transition is as smooth as possible? It's happening, but if this bill goes through, it is going to really blow it apart. What will be the impact on public safety if this bill is passed and people in outer Melbourne growth areas are not covered by paid firefighters? Now, if you listen to Minister Cash, you would think that the enterprise bargaining agreement is an attack on volunteer firefighters due to a union takeover of their activities. Again, listening to witnesses at the inquiry, it became clear that the concerns of volunteers who thought the EBA would unfairly impact on them arose from misinformation. Where correct information was available, volunteers understood that the proposed EBA does not affect volunteers. Mr Justine Rees, First Lieutenant and volunteer firefighter with the Meltone Brigade, said that we have formally expressed this to the Volunteer Fire Brigades Victoria. Mr Rees went on to state, "The Volunteer Bill 2016, if implemented, will affect our relationship with our members, staff and volunteers and impact our service delivery. Encouraging volunteer organisations to intervene into the employment matters and conditions of people employed by emergency services is not appropriate. We need to be focused on supporting our community, protecting life and property and supporting our emergency service people, volunteer and career." So clearly said. Professor Andrew Stewart, an expert in industrial relations from the University of Adelaide, told the committee that the bill was a recipe for increased complexity, uncertainty and disputation. Again, a reminder to senators here, this bill takes us down a very irresponsible and dangerous path. We are dealing here with emergency services who need to be able to work in a coordinated, cooperative way, and that's what is ripped apart if this bill is passed. Professor Stewart set out to the inquiry how the bill will require the Fair Work Commission to move into the highly problematic area of attempting to form judgments about how an organisation such as the CFA should construct a proper balanced paid and volunteer firefighters. Professor Stewart also explained how the bill would require the Fair Work Commission to determine matters that properly reside within the authority of the CFA and the State Government of Victoria to resolve. That's why you come to the conclusion that disputation will increase if this bill goes ahead. And one of those issues to be resolved is the very important matter that I mentioned earlier, the conclusion of the Victorian Royal Commission into Bushfires that more paid firefighters are needed in urban growth areas. That's what a responsible government would be working with the Victorian government to resolve. The need that has been identified by the Royal Commission is clear. A vote for this bill is a vote against this important recommendation. It really is a life-saving recommendation. We need to be very clear. This issue of public safety has been swept aside by the government, and we need to get this back into focus. We're on the edge of summer. Bushfires, wildfires are sweeping the world. We know that this is regularly what happens in Australia. We've seen the tragedies in many states, and Victoria has often been the worst affected. It is deeply alarming that the government is willing to sacrifice public safety and not deal with the key issue here. And what then becomes relevant in considering this issue is the hidden grenades in this bill that again I urge all members to acquaint themselves with. The bill is not clear as to which emergency service organisations will be covered by the legislation. The bill creates an undisclosed list of employers that are designated emergency management body. That's a term that's used. Now, this is a serious development and shows it attempts to undermine good faith approach to negotiations for enterprise agreements. The bill, if passed, will undermine the principle of collective bargaining and, in effect, the authority and ability of the Fair Work Commission to do its job. Then there's the issue of the definition of a volunteer in the bill. The definition is so broad it includes individuals who receive payment for volunteering. There is also the wide-ranging definition of volunteer bodies, which opens up the possibility of a party not covered by the enterprise agreement being able to intervene. This could mean workers denied wage rises, the undermining of other parts of the agreement. That's again why Professor Stewart identified that this bill, if passed, will most likely result in much greater disputation. The Ambulance Employees Australia have given compelling evidence of why this legislation should be abandoned. Minister Cash's management of the issue is also relevant to the debate, and her commentary in some ways has been of assistance to expose what is really going on here. Minister Cash's opinion piece in the Herald Sun on the 22nd of August, she had two blatant areas of misinformation. One was that 7 paid firefighters, union members, had to be present before the CFA personnel are able to be deployed to a fire. The other one was the paid firefighters to report only to other paid firefighters, not CFA commanders. Now, she wrote this piece, published in the Herald Sun, and clearly she's out there arguing her case. But when you look into what she asserts, it just doesn't stack up. If it was the case that volunteers deployed to the fire had to sit there and wait until paid staff turned up, I acknowledge it would be a concern. But again, that's not what the agreement says. So why did the minister state that? In her address in reply, she should really detail why did she misunderstand the bill? Why was she arguing the opposite of what the case is? What the agreement says is that in these areas where you have volunteers and professionals overlapping, 7 firefighters have to be deployed, but they do not have to turn up before the volunteers can start fighting the fire. If the volunteers turn up first, they start first. They start fighting the fire first, not what the minister said when she wrote her article. Now, as I said, that's what the agreement says. It is to ensure that the minimum number of firefighters who can fight a fire safely are on their way and are going to turn up at some point. Now, why 7? Also worth asking. It's understood to be the minimum for safe standards. Again, we're coming back all the time to the issue of public safety, and what we see from the intent of the bill, the minister's comments, the minister's misrepresentation of the EBA, is that it undermines public safety. And that's where I would urge that all members give consideration when they're thinking about how they're going to vote. Public safety needs to be front of their mind. Now, as I said, the minister also had this other argument about the bill, where she asserts that under the EBA, paid firefighters could only report to other paid firefighters, not CFA commanders, implying that paid firefighters cannot report to volunteers. Now, again, I asked the minister, why did she say that? It's untrue. Clause 77.5 is clear. The first arriving incident controller on a scene can determine the number of appliances and crews, and elsewhere the agreement refers to the incident controller, who could be a volunteer. Again, no undermining of the role of volunteers, a very cooperative way of working together. That's, the EBA is something that we can learn from, that we can be impressed by, because in the complexity, which obviously there is when you come to fighting fires, it's working through how our volunteer and our paid staff work together. But what do we get from the minister? This constant abuse of paid firefighters. Now, the Minister has said that the CFA must get the approval of the union for any policy, and I'm quoting here, for any policy that affects the application or operation of this agreement or the work of employees covered by it. Now, what the Minister has not acknowledged, and what should have been her starting point, is that the agreement states on page 11, I quote, "For the avoidance of doubt, except as provided in clause 60, peer support, nothing in this agreement shall prevent volunteers in the CFA from providing the services normally provided by such volunteers without remuneration." There is nothing in this agreement shall prevent volunteers in the CFA from providing the services normally provided by such volunteers without remuneration. The role of volunteers is explicitly protected right up front in the agreement. Again, this needs to be centre in our mind when we're considering how we vote on this bill. The lies that are being pushed by the Minister, by those trying to get this bill passed, are extreme, and the seriousness of it needs to be put side by side with the question of public safety. The Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation has also called for this bill to be rejected. In their submission, they identify the significant overreach of this bill that exposes the political opportunism that is at the heart of the government's decision to introduce the bill. The Australian Nursing Federation sets out that where the Commonwealth moves to involve itself in the activities of state agencies established for public purposes, it needs considered policy analysis, and no such analysis has been given by the government to justify this bill. So, as I've given such strong emphasis in my comments to the issue of public safety, I did want to return to the issue of bushfires. It was in 2009 that the Black Saturday fires ravaged Victoria. 173 people died in those tragic events. The Black Saturday fires were subsequently investigated, as we know, by the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, which found serious and systemic issues within the fire agencies that prevented effective and efficient coordination and unambiguous management of the fires, including that on, I quote, the 7th of February, there was no single person in charge of operational planning, tasking and accountability. Now, the Royal Commission then recommended greater interoperability as an absolute priority. Now, the EBA, what will be effectively undermined and largely destroyed if this bill goes through, goes a huge way to achieving what the Royal Commission set out was essential if we're going to be able to effectively fight bushfires and put public safety first. So again, these issues are very critical in how we handle, in how we vote when we come to consider this bill. Because what we're seeing here is that it's a government that's prepared to put its obsession with undermining working conditions, attacking unions before public safety, that they're committed to working hard to divide volunteers from paid firefighting staff. And there were so many examples of where that cooperation is real, effective and quite vital to being able to fight fires effectively. So effectively the government have been running a major scare campaign. A scare campaign misleading volunteers by telling them things that are simply untrue. A scare campaign attempting to mislead senators who will shortly vote on this bill on things that are untrue. We've heard about the union-busting law firm that was brought in, which again shows what the intent here has been. As part of a wider agenda, I acknowledge something that needs to be explored. But right now, what needs to be centre of our mind when we come to vote on this bill, do we put public safety first, or do we put a very narrow, self-interested agenda of the government and Minister Michaelia Cash first? Surely we should be putting public safety first, because this EBA, at the heart of it, is about improving the operations of the firefighting services in Victoria, both volunteer and paid, in a way that is actually commendable and shouldn't be undermined If you vote for this bill and we undermine the EBA, it's certainly undermining and putting public safety at risk. Thank you.
Senator Patterson.